In the crimson shadows of a forgotten tomb, beneath the ancient sands of Korriban, something stirs, a presence that has witnessed the rise and fall of empires, the birth and death of legends. A power so absolute that even 5,000 years after his mortal flesh turned to dust, the galaxy still trembles at the whisper of his name. Marka Ragnos, Dark Lord of the Sith, conqueror, immortal. Picture this, a duel that split an empire, a reign that lasted a century without challenge, a death that changed nothing, for how can you kill what refuses to die? His spirit rises from the grave, eyes burning with the fires of ancient worlds, judging those who dare claim his throne. And when the very stones of Korriban crack open, and a possessed vessel channels his wrath against the Jedi, you begin to understand this is no mere ghost story. This is the chronicle of power, absolute, of legacy, eternal, of a king who built paradise and watched it crumble to ash, yet refused to fade into the silence of history. From the blood-soaked sands where he murdered his rival, to the catastrophic war his death triggered, to the moment a young Jedi faces the resurrected fury of the ancient Sith's darkest master. But here is the question that haunts the Force itself. How does a Sith Lord dead for 50 centuries still command the dark side? What sorcery binds spirit to stone? And why, after millennia of silence, does his rage echo across the stars once more? Hey everyone, tonight we journey into the complete saga of Marka Ragnos, the Sith Lord whose power transcended death itself. A tale of ambition, supremacy, and the terrible price of immortality. Now here's something interesting. Around 64% of you watching right now haven't subscribed yet. If you're enjoying these deep dives into Star Wars legends, hitting that subscribe button really helps the channel grow and lets me bring you more of these epic stories. Drop a comment, letting me know where in the world you're listening from and what time it is there. I always love seeing our global community of Star Wars fans coming together, whether it's midnight in New York or morning in Mumbai. So go ahead, dim those lights, get comfortable under your blanket, maybe let a fan hum softly in the background, and let's begin the legend of the king who never truly died. Our story begins approximately 5,100 years before the Battle of Yavin, in an era when the Sith Empire stood at the zenith of its power, unchallenged, magnificent, and utterly merciless. Imagine the Sith Empire not as the shadow conspiracy of later millennia, but as a civilization unto itself, vast fleets of wedge-shaped warships patrolling the Stygian caldera, entire star systems bowing before the might of crimson-bladed Sith Lords. This was the Golden Age, when the dark side flowed through every temple, every meditation chamber, every breath of the Sith people. At the heart of this empire lay two worlds of immense significance: Korriban, the sacred homeworld, where red sand stretched endlessly beneath a rust-colored sky, where the Valley of the Dark Lords housed the tombs of ancient kings, where the very air thrummed with dark side energy, so potent that merely walking its surface could corrupt the weak-minded, and Ziost, the administrative capital, a world of obsidian spires and frozen wastes, where the Sith Council convened and the machinery of empire ground forward with ruthless efficiency. Into this realm of power and darkness, Marka Ragnos was born. His origins remain shrouded in the mists of ancient history, but what we know paints a fascinating picture. Ragnos was neither full Sith pure blood nor entirely human. He was hybrid, born of two bloodlines. His Sith heritage gave him the distinctive features of that ancient species, the strong connection to the dark side that ran through their very genes. His human ancestry provided something else entirely, an unpredictability, an innovation that pure Sith tradition sometimes lacked. In the rigid hierarchy of the Sith Empire, such mixed heritage was both blessing and curse. The old guard, the pure-blooded Sith aristocracy, viewed hybrids with suspicion as dilution of their sacred lineage. Yet they could not deny what the Force itself proclaimed: power is power, regardless of its source. And Ragnos possessed power in abundance. From his earliest years, it became clear that this was no ordinary child. His command of the Force manifested early and grew exponentially. His tactical mind grasped the intricacies of Sith politics and warfare with frightening ease. His ambition burned with the intensity of a collapsing star. The Sith Empire of this era was ruled by a Dark Lord, supported by a council of powerful Sith Lords who governed various territories and domains. It was a system built on strength, where power struggles and duels for dominance were not merely accepted but encouraged. Only the strong deserved to rule, only the ruthless survived. Young Ragnos understood this fundamental truth better than most. He trained relentlessly. He studied the ancient Sith arts. He observed the power games of his elders with cold, calculating eyes, and he waited. Because Marka Ragnos knew something that would define his entire existence. Greatness is not given, it is taken. The death of a Dark Lord is never a quiet affair. When the reigning Sith Master finally succumbed to age, assassination, or the inevitable betrayal that came with absolute dominion, the Empire did not mourn. It convulsed. Every ambitious Sith Lord, every cunning sorceress, every battle-hardened warrior saw the same thing: opportunity. But from the chaos of potential claimants, two names rose above all others. Two titans whose very presence commanded the attention of the entire Sith hierarchy. The Empire would be forced to choose, or more accurately, these two would force the Empire to watch as they decided the matter in the most ancient and honored Sith tradition. Through blood. Simus was everything the old guard revered. A pure-blood Sith of impeccable lineage, his family tree stretched back through generations of Dark Lords and Sith royalty. His skin bore the deep crimson hue of his species, his features sharp and aristocratic. He had served the previous Dark Lord with distinction, commanding fleets and crushing rebellions with methodical precision. To the traditionalists, the choice was obvious. Simus represented continuity, the preservation of Sith racial purity, the old ways that had served the Empire for millennia. He was ancient, powerful, and utterly convinced of his own superiority. Marka Ragnos represented something else entirely. Where Simus embodied tradition, Ragnos embodied evolution. His mixed heritage, once whispered about in the corridors of power as a weakness, had instead forged something unprecedented. He combined the raw dark side potency of Sith blood with the adaptability and cunning of human ancestry. His approach to warfare was innovative, incorporating tactics that pure tradition would never consider. His Force abilities had grown to staggering heights, surpassing many who claimed superior bloodlines. More importantly, Ragnos understood something fundamental about power that Simus, for all his breeding, did not. Legitimacy meant nothing if you lacked the strength to enforce it. The philosophical divide ran deeper than mere politics. Simus believed the Sith Empire's strength lay in preserving racial purity, in maintaining the ancient hierarchies and traditions that had built their civilization. Ragnos saw stagnation in such thinking. He believed that power should flow to those who could wield it most effectively, regardless of whose veins carried the most concentrated Sith DNA. The Empire began splitting along these ideological fault lines. The old families, the pure-blooded aristocracy, the keepers of ancient rites and traditions rallied behind Simus. The younger generation, the ambitious warriors who had risen through merit rather than birth, the pragmatists who valued results over lineage, they saw their future in Ragnos. Neither faction would yield, neither candidate would withdraw, and so, as Sith tradition demanded, the matter would be settled on Korriban itself, on the sacred ground where Dark Lords had dueled since time immemorial. The gathered Sith Lords assembled in their thousands. This was more than a duel. It was a statement about the Empire's future, a referendum on what it meant to be Sith. Every lord of significance attended, their ceremonial robes whipping in the hot wind that perpetually scoured Korriban's surface. The Valley of the Dark Lords served as witness, those ancient tombs holding the spirits of Sith kings past, watching as their descendants continued the eternal cycle of challenge and dominance. The air itself seemed to thicken with anticipation. The dark side, always present on Korriban, intensified until even the weakest Force-sensitive could feel it pressing against their consciousness like a physical weight. Simus arrived first, his bearing regal and confident. He had fought and won dozens of duels throughout his long life. He had commanded armies and bent rival lords to his will. Age had not diminished him but refined him, turning raw power into precise, devastating technique. His lightsaber, a traditional Sith design passed down through his family, ignited with a crimson blade that seemed to drink in the dying light of Korriban's sun. Marka Ragnos entered the dueling ground without ceremony or pretense. He wore no elaborate robes, no ancient regalia. His lightsaber was his own creation, not an heirloom, but a weapon forged through his own connection to the dark side. Where Simus represented the weight of history, Ragnos embodied the sharp edge of the present moment. They faced each other across the red sand, and for a heartbeat, the galaxy held its breath. The duel began not with a rush, but with patience. These were not apprentices eager to prove themselves. These were masters of their craft, and masters understood that the opening moves of any engagement often determined its conclusion. They circled, lightsabers humming, each probing the other's defense with subtle shifts in stance and bearing. Simus struck first, a classical Sith opening combination that had been perfected over centuries. His blade work was flawless, each strike flowing seamlessly into the next, his footwork carrying him across the sand with practiced grace. He fought the way ancient Sith had always fought, drawing on techniques preserved in holocrons and passed from master to apprentice across generations. Ragnos met each strike with an economy of motion that bordered on insulting. He did not match Simus's elaborate forms. He simply moved where the blade was not, his defense minimal but devastatingly effective. And when he countered, his attacks came from angles that orthodox Sith training did not anticipate. The assembled lords watched in growing tension as the duel intensified. Simus began incorporating Sith sorcery into his assault, tendrils of malevolent force lashing out between blade strikes, attempting to overwhelm Ragnos through sheer versatility of attack. Lightning crackled. The sand beneath their feet began to crystallize from the heat and energy being unleashed. But Ragnos was not there to participate in a display of traditional prowess. He was there to win. He began dismantling Simus's assault with calculated brutality. Every opening the Elder Sith created, Ragnos exploited. Every moment Simus committed fully to an attack, Ragnos made him pay for the overextension. This was not the duel of two equals feeling each other out. This was a predator recognizing that its prey, for all its apparent strength, was already defeated. Simus, sensing the shift in momentum, abandoned technique for raw power. He channeled the dark side with decades of practiced skill, his attacks becoming a storm of crimson energy and blade work. The very air screamed with the violence being unleashed. Lesser duelists would have been vaporized. Ragnos walked through it like a man strolling through a spring rain. His counter, when it came, was almost anticlimactic in its simplicity. A single opening, barely a fraction of a second, where Simus overcommitted to a killing stroke. Ragnos's blade moved in an arc so fast that many witnesses claimed they never saw it, only the result. Simus's head separated from his shoulders with surgical precision. The body collapsed to the sand, and in the sudden silence that followed, the only sound was the wind and the hum of Ragnos's lightsaber. He stood over his fallen rival, not in triumph but in cold assessment, as if confirming the completion of an inevitable task. The gathered Sith Lords did not immediately react. They had witnessed something that would be spoken of for millennia. Not just a victory, but a statement. The old order, represented by Simus's perfect lineage and traditional mastery, had been cut down by merit and innovation. The message was clear. Bloodline meant nothing. Only power mattered. Ragnos deactivated his lightsaber and turned to face the assembly. No one moved. No one spoke. And then, as one, they knelt. Even those who had supported Simus, even the most die-hard traditionalists, they bent their knees to the sand. Marka Ragnos had become Dark Lord of the Sith, but he was not content with mere acknowledgement. Simus's supporters were numerous and powerful. They had bent the knee because tradition demanded it, but Ragnos understood that resentment left to fester would become rebellion. His consolidation of power was swift and absolute. Those who accepted his rule with genuine loyalty were elevated. Those who harbored lingering allegiance to the old ways found themselves facing increasingly impossible tasks, assignments that would either prove their worth or eliminate them. Some were executed outright when evidence of conspiracy emerged. Others simply disappeared. Their names struck from records, their possessions distributed to more faithful servants. Ragnos restructured the Sith hierarchy with ruthless efficiency. He created systems of mutual surveillance, ensuring that ambitious lords would spend as much energy watching each other as they might plotting against him. He promoted talent regardless of bloodline, a revolutionary concept that both terrified the old aristocracy and energized the younger generation. The coronation ceremony, when it finally occurred, was less a celebration than a demonstration. Ancient Sith rituals were performed, dark side energies channeled through artifacts older than recorded history. Ragnos stood at the center of it all, absorbing the power, binding himself to the Empire in ways both symbolic and literal through Sith alchemy and sorcery. He emerged from that ceremony, changed. The title of Dark Lord was not merely political, it was a transformation. A fusion of the individual with the collective dark side strength of the Sith legacy. Ragnos could feel the power of his predecessors flowing through him, their knowledge accessible, their strength adding to his own. The Empire had its master, and that master had plans. Marka Ragnos did not believe in ruling through fear alone. Terror was a tool, certainly useful for breaking resistance and establishing dominance, but an empire built solely on fear was brittle, prone to shattering the moment that fear wavered. True power required something more sophisticated. Absolute control combined with calculated rewards, testability enforced through overwhelming strength, and most critically, giving his subjects a vision of prosperity that made rebellion seem not just dangerous but foolish. The first decade of his reign was dedicated to eliminating any possibility of challenge. Those Sith Lords who had harbored hopes of eventual uprising found themselves facing a Dark Lord whose intelligence network seemed almost prescient. Plots were discovered before they fully formed. Conspirators vanished in the night, and yet for those who served loyally, rewards flowed generously. Ragnos understood that ambition properly channeled strengthened the Empire rather than threatening it. He created opportunities for advancement, military campaigns against frontier worlds that allowed aggressive Sith Lords to prove themselves and gain glory. These conquests served dual purposes. They expanded the Empire's reach while providing outlets for the violent ambitions that might otherwise turn inward. His military innovations became legendary. Traditional Sith warfare relied heavily on individual Force users overwhelming enemy positions through sheer dark side power. Ragnos maintained this approach but added strategic depth. He integrated conventional military tactics with Force applications in ways that multiplied their effectiveness. Sith battle meditation coordinated fleet movements. Sith alchemy enhanced weapons and soldiers. Sorcery disrupted enemy communications and morale. World after world fell before his campaigns, some through direct assault, others through more subtle means. Ragnos demonstrated equal mastery of both approaches. He could lead an army through the breach of a fortress wall, his lightsaber cutting through defenders, his presence alone demoralizing entire garrisons. Or he could orchestrate the political collapse of a planetary government from light years away, manipulating factions and leaders until they begged to join the Empire. The conquered territories were not simply subjugated, they were integrated. Ragnos established administrative systems that extracted resources efficiently without bleeding worlds dry. Happy slaves were more productive than desperate ones. Prosperous subject species provided better tribute than starving populations. It was exploitation, certainly, but exploitation refined to an art form. On Korriban and Zeost, massive construction projects began. New temples rose from the red sand, monuments to Sith power and dark side mastery. These were not merely buildings but focal points of ancient sorcery, places where the barrier between the physical and the Force grew thin. Sith Lords could meditate in these temples and achieve insights that would have taken decades elsewhere. The Valley of the Dark Lords expanded with new tombs, though none yet for Ragnos himself. He was planning his own eternal resting place with meticulous care, ensuring that when death inevitably came, he would have a monument worthy of his achievements. The tomb would be more than stone and darkness. It would be a nexus of Sith power, a place where the dark side concentrated so intensely that even centuries later, its potency would remain undimmed. Sith knowledge flourished under his rule. Ancient texts that had been hoarded by individual lords were catalogued and made accessible to those who proved worthy. Holocrons containing the wisdom of dead Dark Lords were studied, and their techniques incorporated into training regimens. Ragnos himself contributed to this growing library of darkness, recording his own insights and innovations for future generations. He was creating not just an empire but a legacy, a civilization of the dark side that would endure beyond his lifetime. Alchemy laboratories on Zeost produced creatures and devices of terrible power. Sith sorcerers pushed the boundaries of what the dark side could achieve, twisting life and matter according to their will. Some experiments resulted in weapons, others in living abominations that served as guards and enforcers. The ethical considerations that might have restrained Jedi researchers were absent here. Only results mattered. Yet for all the darkness, there was order. Ragnos established laws and systems of justice. Sith justice certainly, harsh and unforgiving, but predictable. Citizens knew what was expected. Deliver your tribute, serve your masters, do not plot rebellion, and you would be left to your own affairs. It was tyranny, but it was stable tyranny. The Sith Lords who served under him were granted significant autonomy over their own domains. As long as tribute flowed to the throne, and they answered the Dark Lord's summons, they could rule their territories as they saw fit. This delegation of power accomplished multiple objectives. It satisfied ambitious lords by giving them kingdoms of their own. It created a buffer of middlemen between Ragnos and the masses, and it ensured that any single lord who turned traitor could be crushed by the combined might of all the others. Ragnos himself continued growing in power. His mastery over the Force deepened with each passing year. He developed techniques for extending his lifespan beyond natural limits, drawing on the dark side to sustain his physical form. This was not immortality. Not yet, but it was a denial of normal aging, where other Sith might have weakened in their later years. Ragnos remained in his prime decade after decade. He studied the nature of death itself, poring over ancient Sith texts that spoke of spirit persistence and consciousness beyond physical form. These were not idle philosophical musings. Ragnos was pragmatically researching methods to ensure that even death would not end his influence. He experimented with binding his essence to objects, places, and the Force itself. These experiments would have consequences far beyond his imagination. Diplomatic relations extended beyond the Empire's borders. There were other dark side organizations in the galaxy, cults and cabals, that worshipped various aspects of the Force's darker manifestations. Ragnos established contact, exchanging knowledge while carefully maintaining Sith superiority. These groups would never be equals, but they could be useful tools. The Empire's economy thrived under structured exploitation. Trade routes connected Sith worlds, carrying exotic goods and vital resources. Slavery fueled the labor force. But even here, Ragnos introduced refinements. Skilled slaves were valued and treated accordingly, incentivized to maintain their productivity. The brutality was not random but calculated. Art and culture flourished in twisted forms. Sith architecture favored imposing grandeur, structures designed to make individuals feel small and powerless before the might of the Empire. Sith literature celebrated strength, ambition, and the dark side's glory. Even music served the Empire, compositions that resonated with twisted energies, performances that could entrance and manipulate audiences. Through all of this, Ragnos remained the apex predator. Other Sith Lords were powerful, some extraordinarily so, but none approached his level. His presence at gatherings dominated every room. When he spoke, all listened. When he commanded, all obeyed. Not merely from fear, though fear certainly played its role, but from recognition that his power was simply beyond challenge. Years became decades. The Sith Empire enjoyed unprecedented prosperity and expansion. Conquest followed conquest. Tribute filled the treasuries. The machinery of imperial administration operated with increasing efficiency. And at the center of it all, Marka Ragnos sat upon his throne, immortal in all but name, architect of the greatest era the Sith would ever know. The question that never quite left his mind was simple. How long could perfection last? 100 years, a century of absolute rule. For most beings, this would represent 4 or 5 entire lifetimes. For Marka Ragnos, it was a single continuous reign, an unbroken thread of dominion stretching across generations. The early decades focused on external expansion and internal consolidation. The Sith Empire's borders pushed outward into unexplored space, claiming systems and bringing new species under imperial authority. Each conquest added resources and subjects, feeding the realm's growing appetite. Ragnos personally led many of these campaigns, his presence on the battlefield serving both practical and symbolic purposes. His tactical brilliance manifested repeatedly in unexpected ways. During the subjugation of Jaguada, a heavily fortified world whose defenders possessed advanced weapons technology, Ragnos eschewed the expected frontal assault. Instead, he spent months infiltrating the planet using Sith assassins and spies, mapping political landscapes and identifying factional tensions. When the attack came, it targeted the planetary government itself rather than military installations. The world surrendered within days, its weapons factories intact and immediately repurposed for imperial use. The campaign on Relg demonstrated different skills entirely. The native species possessed strong sensitivity to mystical energies and had developed their own primitive traditions. Rather than exterminating potential rivals, Ragnos saw opportunity. He conquered through overwhelming military force combined with seductive promises of forbidden knowledge. The Relg Force users were given a choice: submit to Sith training and join the Empire's ranks or face annihilation. Most chose survival, and their unique techniques were absorbed into the broader Sith knowledge base. As the realm expanded, administration grew more complex. Ragnos established the position of Sith Overseer, lords responsible for managing entire sectors of space. These overseers reported directly to the Dark Lord, creating hierarchical structure that maintained central control while allowing regional flexibility. It was exploitation refined to an art form, extracting maximum resources without bleeding worlds completely dry. The middle period of his reign saw remarkable cultural flourishing. With borders secure and internal stability maintained, resources could be directed toward pursuits beyond mere survival and conquest. The Great Library of Zayast was established, a massive repository containing everything from battle tactics to alchemical formulas to philosophical treatises on Shadow's nature. Sith temples became centers of learning and cultivation of malevolent arts. Promising acolytes from across the Imperium gathered at these institutions, training under masters in lightsaber combat, manipulation of cosmic energies, and political intrigue. The curriculum was brutally meritocratic. Failure meant death or slavery. Success meant authority and advancement. This system produced practitioners of exceptional capability, hardened by competition and shaped by corruption. Ragnos took personal interest in developing new techniques and pushing boundaries that previous generations had considered too dangerous or ambitious. He developed methods for draining life force from living beings and channeling that energy into objects or himself. This vampiric technique allowed rapid healing of injuries and sustained physical enhancement. It required victims, but for an empire built on subjugation, victims were abundant. His exploration of memory manipulation reached frightening sophistication. Through careful application of supernatural abilities, Ragnos could extract memories from unwilling minds, implant false recollections, or simply erase inconvenient truths. This made him nearly impossible to deceive and allowed unprecedented control over subordinates. A Sith Lord might plot rebellion only to forget those plans entirely after a private audience with the Dark Lord. Perhaps most significant were his advances in spirit binding, building on ancient traditions to develop techniques for anchoring consciousness to physical locations and objects. The theory was elegant. Cosmic currents connected all things, and with sufficient will and knowledge, one could forge permanent connections between essence and matter. Practical application proved far more challenging and required extensive experimentation with live subjects. Most attempts ended in complete annihilation of the subject's awareness. A few resulted in twisted half-existences, shades trapped in eternal torment, neither truly alive nor completely dissolved. These failures served as cautionary examples, displayed in secure chambers where advanced students could study what happened when ambition exceeded capability. The rare successes demonstrated the technique's potential. Ragnos managed to bind the consciousness of a dying Sith Lord to a holocron, preserving not just recorded teachings but actual personality and awareness. This living holocron could interact with students, answer questions, provide guidance that simple recordings never could. It was a form of immortality, however limited and confined. These experiments had deeply personal application. Ragnos was preparing for his own death, accepting its inevitability while scheming to transcend its finality. His tomb, under construction on Korriban throughout these decades, was being designed as both monument and anchor point. Every stone placed according to precise alchemical formulas, every corridor aligned with flows of corrupting influence, every chamber serving a purpose in the grand design. In the later decades, Ragnos grew more contemplative. With external threats neutralized and internal opposition crushed, he had time for reflection. He began recording his thoughts and experiences in detail, creating multiple holocrons that contained not just techniques but philosophy. What did it mean to rule absolutely? How should supremacy be wielded? What was the ultimate purpose of Sith dominance? His answers evolved over time. Initially, authority had been its own justification. Strength deserved to rule because strength could rule. But a century of unchallenged dominion brought deeper questions. Legacy became increasingly important. What mark would he leave on galactic history? Would the Sith Empire survive his death, or would it collapse into civil war? The question of succession haunted his thoughts more with each passing year. He had deliberately avoided naming an heir, maintaining traditional Sith approach of letting might flow to whoever could claim it. But watching the ambitious lords in his court, he began doubting this wisdom. None seemed quite worthy of what he had built. Two names rose above others as potential successors: Ludo Kresh, a conservative lord who believed in maintaining current borders and focusing on internal strength, and Naga Sado, an ambitious visionary who dreamed of expanding the realm into unexplored space and challenging any force that dared oppose Sith dominance. Ragnos saw merit in both philosophies and fatal flaws in both men. Gressy's caution would preserve what had been built but might allow stagnation. Sado's aggression might elevate the Sith to even greater heights or destroy everything in reckless gambles. The question was which approach would prove superior in trials ahead. He made a decision that seemed wise at the time, but would prove catastrophic. He would not choose between them. Instead, he would let events after his death determine who deserved the throne. The strongest would emerge victorious. It was the Sith way, the method that had elevated him to supremacy decades earlier. What he failed to anticipate was how evenly matched they would prove, how their conflict would tear the Imperium apart rather than strengthening it through decisive victory. But that realization would come too late. For now, Marka Ragnos sat upon his throne, master of the greatest Sith empire in history, his might seemingly eternal, his reign apparently without end. Time, however, comes for everyone, even Dark Lords. Section 6. The Final Years and Death. 150 words. Age finds every living thing eventually, even those who bend the Force itself to their will. Marka Ragnos had ruled for nearly a century, his physical form sustained far beyond natural limits through constant application of dark side energies. But the techniques that extended his life were not without cost. Each year required more effort to maintain, more focus to keep decay at bay. His body had become a battleground where willpower contested against biology, and biology, patient and inexorable, was gaining ground. He felt it in small ways at first. Meditations that once recharged him now merely staved off exhaustion. Wounds that would have healed within hours began taking days. His connection to the Force remained as strong as ever, perhaps even deeper, after decades of cultivation, but the vessel containing that power was wearing thin. Ragnos was not afraid of death. Fear was for the weak, for those who clung desperately to existence because they had accomplished nothing worth remembering. He had built an empire. He had expanded the boundaries of Sith knowledge. His name would echo through history, regardless of how much longer he drew breath. What concerned him was not death itself, but what came after. Would the empire survive his passing? Would his century of work crumble in a matter of years because those who came after lacked his vision and strength? He spent his final decade preparing as methodically as he had once prepared for military campaigns. The tomb on Korriban neared completion, a masterwork of Sith architecture and alchemy. Its chambers were arranged according to precise geometric patterns that channeled black arts. The walls were inscribed with Sith runes of power, each one carved by masters of the ancient script. At the tomb's heart lay a sarcophagus of stone quarried from the deepest parts of Korriban, stone that had been saturated with corrupt mastery for millions of years. But the physical tomb was only one component. Ragnos performed rituals that bound his essence to the structure, creating connections between his life force and the stone itself. When death came, these connections would serve as anchors, preventing his consciousness from dissipating completely into the Force. He would not achieve true immortality, not in the sense of continued physical existence, but something perhaps more interesting. A persistence of awareness, a presence that could observe and occasionally influence events even from beyond death's veil. The techniques were experimental, drawing on fragmentary records of similar attempts by ancient Sith whose names were lost to time. Some had succeeded in creating lasting spirits, others had produced nothing but failure and oblivion. Ragnos refined the methods as best he could, combining multiple approaches and adding innovations of his own design. His final holocrons were created during these years, recording not just techniques and knowledge, but aspects of his personality and decision-making processes. Future Sith would be able to consult these devices and receive guidance that felt almost like speaking with Ragnos himself. Almost, but not quite. Holocrons were sophisticated but ultimately limited, capturing echoes rather than true consciousness. The political landscape grew tense as his decline became apparent. Sith Lords who had served faithfully for decades began positioning themselves for the succession. Alliances formed and dissolved, promises were made in shadowed corridors, weapons were quietly accumulated. Everyone could sense the approaching storm. Ludo Kresh represented the old guard, those who believed the Empire's greatest achievements lay in what had already been built rather than in risky expansion. He was methodical, cautious, deeply knowledgeable in Sith traditions and history. His support came primarily from the ancient Sith families, the pure bloods who valued stability and tradition above innovation. Naga Sadow embodied ambition without limit. He looked at the Empire's current borders and saw not accomplishment but constraint. The galaxy was vast, filled with species to conquer and resources to claim. Why should the Sith remain content with their current holdings when so much more lay within reach? His supporters were younger Sith warriors and sorcerers who craved glory and expansion. Ragnos watched the two factions coalesce and deliberately chose not to intervene. This was the Sith way. Strength would determine succession. He had no children, had never bothered with biological legacy, when spiritual and political legacy seemed far more important. Whoever emerged victorious from the coming struggle would have earned the throne through capability. What he did not fully appreciate was how perfectly balanced the two contenders were. In his own rise to power, the duel with Simus had been decisive precisely because Ragnos's superiority was clear. But Kresh and Sadow were near equals in different domains. Kresh was the superior administrator and defender. Sadow was the better innovator and attacker. Neither had an overwhelming advantage. This balance would prove catastrophic, but Ragnos would not live to see the full consequences of his choice. His final months were spent in increasingly deep meditation. He was preparing his consciousness for the transition, training his spirit to maintain coherence after separation from physical form. The process was exhausting, requiring every bit of discipline and willpower he had accumulated over more than a century of life. The Sith Lords around him sensed the end approaching. Meetings of the Sith Council grew more frequent and more tense. Plans were made for the funeral, a ceremony that would need to demonstrate imperial strength even as it acknowledged the loss of its greatest leader. When death finally came, it was quiet. No dramatic final battle, no assassination, no betrayal. Ragnos simply felt his body failing, the techniques that had sustained him for so long losing their effectiveness. He dismissed his attendants, wanting to face this final moment in solitude. Alone in his meditation chamber, Marka Ragnos took one last breath and released it slowly. His heart, which had beaten for over a century, stilled. His physical form went slack, consciousness separating from flesh. But he did not dissipate into the Force as most beings did upon death. The preparations held. His spirit remained cohesive, anchored to the physical world by the rituals and alchemy he had so carefully prepared. He felt himself drawn toward Korriban, toward the tomb that awaited him, settling into the dark side nexus he had created there. From this new perspective, everything seemed different. Physical sensation was gone, replaced by pure Force perception. He could sense the disturbance his death caused, ripples spreading through the dark side as thousands of Force-sensitive beings felt the moment of his passing. The Empire shuddered, like a great beast whose heart had stopped beating. His body was discovered hours later. The attendants who entered his chambers knew immediately what they would find. The Dark Lord's presence, which had dominated every space he occupied, was gone. What remained was simply flesh, already beginning the process of decay. Word spread throughout the Empire within hours. Marka Ragnos, Dark Lord of the Sith for 100 years, was dead. The carefully maintained order he had built immediately began cracking. Crash and Sado, who had maintained surface civility during his life, no longer felt compelled to pretend. Their factions moved into position, preparing for confrontation. The funeral was scheduled to take place on Korriban, in the Valley of the Dark Lords, with every Sith of significance required to attend. It would be the largest gathering of Sith power in living memory, and it would be the moment when the Empire began tearing itself apart. The Valley of the Dark Lords had witnessed many funerals, but never one like this. Thousands gathered on Korriban's red sands, converging from every corner of the Sith Empire. Massive warships filled the orbit above, each one carrying Sith Lords and their retinues. The sky burned with engine trails as shuttles descended continuously, disgorging passengers who joined the growing assembly. This was not merely a funeral. It was a display of power, a gathering of the Empire's entire dark side hierarchy in one location. The atmosphere crackled with barely contained violence. Every Sith Lord present was a predator, accustomed to dominance, uncomfortable in such close proximity to so many rivals. Only the solemnity of the occasion and the weight of tradition kept lightsabers sheathed for now. Ragnos's body had been prepared according to ancient Sith customs. His flesh had been preserved through alchemy, preventing decay, maintaining the appearance of life even in death. He was dressed in ceremonial robes of deep crimson and black, his lightsaber placed upon his chest, his hands positioned in a ritual gesture of power. The body lay upon a stone platform at the valley's center, visible to all who had come to pay respects or simply witness history. The tomb awaited, its entrance carved into the valley wall, a massive doorway flanked by statues of ancient Sith warriors. The chamber within had been prepared with obsessive care, every detail perfect, every rune precisely inscribed. When the ceremony concluded, Ragnos would be sealed inside, and the tomb would become his eternal domain. Ludocris arrived with a large contingent of supporters, their presence a statement of strength. He wore traditional Sith robes, his bearing dignified and solemn. This was a man who understood ceremony, who valued the weight of history and tradition. He took his position near the body, his face composed in appropriate grief, though his eyes constantly scanned the crowd, assessing positions and allegiances. Naga Sado made his entrance with characteristic flair. Where Crash embodied restraint, Sado projected confidence bordering on arrogance. His retinue was smaller, but consisted of the most aggressive and ambitious young Sith Lords in the Empire. They wore their lightsabers openly, a subtle breach of funeral protocol that did not go unnoticed. Sado positioned himself opposite Crash, and the two locked eyes across Ragnos's body, neither willing to show deference. The ceremony began with traditional Sith chants, ancient words in the Sith language that predated the Empire itself. The assembled lords joined in, thousands of voices creating a sound that resonated through the Force, a wave of unholy might that made the air itself seem heavier. This was power on a scale rarely witnessed, the concentrated might of an entire civilization of Force users channeling their abilities in unison. Sith sorcerers performed rituals around the body, drawing symbols in the sand with substances that burned with unnatural fire. The rituals served both practical and symbolic purposes, honoring the dead while also binding any lingering essence to the prepared tomb. They did not know how well Ragnos had already prepared his own spirit binding. That would become apparent soon enough. As the ceremony progressed, something unexpected occurred. A Republic exploration vessel, piloted by two siblings named Gav and Jory Darragon, accidentally stumbled into Sith space through a newly discovered hyperspace route. They were treasure hunters and explorers, seeking fortune on the frontier, completely unaware that they had just made contact with a civilization the Republic did not know existed. Sith warships detected the intrusion immediately. The Republic ship was intercepted, its occupants captured and brought to Korriban. The timing could not have been worse, or from certain perspectives, more opportune. Here was a crisis that demanded immediate attention, occurring at precisely the moment when succession was about to be decided. The Daragons were dragged before the assembled Sith Lords, confused and terrified. They found themselves standing in the Valley of the Dark Lords, surrounded by thousands of beings whose presence in the Force felt like standing next to black holes of malevolence. The funeral ceremony paused as attention shifted to these unexpected prisoners. Ludo Kresh saw threat. These outsiders represented the Republic, a government the Sith had largely ignored for centuries. Their accidental discovery of Sith space could lead to conflict. The Empire was not prepared for, not with succession unresolved and internal stability questionable. His immediate instinct was caution. Interrogate the prisoners, learn what they knew, determine the extent of the threat, and then respond carefully. Naga Sado saw opportunity. The Republic was wealthy, complacent, and from initial reports, militarily unprepared for conflict with the Sith. This was the perfect external threat to unite the fractured empire, the ideal campaign to establish himself as the new Dark Lord. Where Kresh saw danger requiring defensive measures, Sado envisioned conquest and glory. The debate that erupted was fierce. Both Sith Lords made their cases before the assembled hierarchy, each trying to sway the undecided Lords to their perspective. It was, in essence, the beginning of their contest for supremacy, the first open clash of their competing philosophies. Kresh argued with the weight of experience and historical precedent. The Empire was strong, yes, but change was dangerous. Ragnos had built stability through careful management and measured expansion. Launching a war against an unknown opponent, while leadership remained contested, was madness. They should consolidate, secure their borders, and present a unified front before considering external adventures. Sado countered with vision and ambition. The Empire had grown stagnant during Ragnos' later years, focused on administration rather than conquest. These Republic intruders represented not just a threat but a gift, a cause that could unite all Sith under a new Dark Lord's banner. Through war the strongest leader would emerge. Through victory, the Empire would reach heights Ragnos had never imagined. The assembled Lords split, some swayed by Kresh's caution, others inspired by Sado's boldness. The divide was not clean. Many remained undecided, waiting to see which faction would prove dominant before committing themselves. And then, as the argument reached its peak, with Sith Lords shouting across Ragnos' body and the carefully planned funeral descending into chaos, something unprecedented occurred. The tomb behind them began to glow, not with natural light, but with primordial darkness, so concentrated it became visible, a sickly luminescence that pulsed like a heartbeat. The temperature dropped despite Korriban's normally hot climate. Frost formed on weapons and armor. Breath became visible in the suddenly frigid air. Every Sith Lord felt it simultaneously, a presence emerging from the tomb, power on a scale that dwarfed even the assembled might of the Empire's greatest living Force users. This was not imagination or mass hallucination. Something was manifesting, pulling itself from beyond death's veil back into the physical realm. The crowd fell silent. Kresh and Sado both stopped mid-argument, turning toward the tomb. The Daragon siblings, who understood nothing of what was happening, felt only primal terror at the wrongness saturating the air. From the tomb's entrance, a figure emerged, not physical flesh but spirit, a form composed of corrupt mastery, translucent yet somehow more real than the living Sith surrounding it. The figure was unmistakably Marka Ragnos, taller than he had been in life, wreathed in power that crackled and sparked like lightning. He carried his scepter, the ceremonial weapon that had been one of his most prized possessions in life. The scepter blazed with crimson light, its head shaped like a stylized Sith Lanvarok. In the hands of his spirit, It seemed less a symbol and more a genuine weapon, capable of striking down any who dared challenge his will. Ragnos's eyes swept across the gathered Sith, and every lord present felt the weight of that gaze. This was judgment, assessment, and condemnation, all in one. The spirit's presence was overwhelming, oppressive, making even the most powerful Sith feel like apprentices again, children standing before a master whose authority was absolute. When he spoke, the voice came from everywhere and nowhere, resonating through the Force itself, rather than through air vibrations. It was Ragnos's voice, but transformed, carrying harmonics that made listeners' bones ache and their minds recoil. He addressed them not with greetings, but with disappointment. Here was his empire, the civilization he had built and nurtured for a century, and within hours of his death they were tearing at each other like starving animals. The funeral meant to honor his passing had become a stage for petty power struggles and short-sighted arguments. Ragnos's spirit turned its attention to Kresh and Sado specifically. Both felt the full weight of his regard, and both discovered that even in death, their former master could inspire terror. He declared them unworthy, not individually, but in their current state. Both possessed potential, yes, but also fatal flaws. Kresh's caution bordered on cowardice. Sado's ambition lacked wisdom. He spoke of the Republic prisoners, warning that hasty action against unknown enemies had destroyed empires before, yet he also cautioned against paranoia and isolation. The Sith existed to dominate, and dominance required engagement with the galaxy, not withdrawal from it. His prophecy was vague, deliberately so. He spoke of trials ahead, of challenges that would test whether the Empire deserved to survive. He warned of recklessness leading to ruin, but also of excessive caution breeding weakness. In essence, he condemned both approaches while offering no clear path forward. The spirit's appearance lasted perhaps 5 minutes, though to those present it felt both longer and shorter, time seeming distorted by the sheer power being channeled. And then, with a final sweep of his gaze across the assembled Sith, Ragnos's spirit withdrew, retreating back into the tomb, the glow fading, the temperature returning to normal. Silence held for several heartbeats after his departure. Then, gradually the Sith Lords began to react. Some fell to their knees, overwhelmed by what they had witnessed. Others stood frozen, minds struggling to process the impossible. A few, the most ambitious and foolish, immediately began interpreting Ragnos's words to support their preferred outcomes. Christ believed the warning against recklessness vindicated his cautious approach. Sado interpreted the condemnation of isolation as endorsement for aggressive action. Both were wrong, or perhaps both were right. Ragnos had deliberately avoided choosing between them, even from beyond death. The funeral resumed, but the ceremony's tone had changed. The body was carried into the tomb and placed within the sarcophagus. Sith alchemists sealed the chamber using techniques that would take dedicated teams weeks to undo. The tomb entrance was closed with a massive stone door, and additional wards were placed to prevent casual intrusion. But everyone present knew the truth. Ragnos was not truly gone. His spirit persisted within that tomb, aware and watching. What they had witnessed was not some final trick or illusion. The Dark Lord had transcended death itself, achieving a form of immortality that even other Sith could barely comprehend. The gathered Sith dispersed slowly, factions separating, alliances solidifying. The fragile peace of the funeral could not hold much longer. Kresh and Sado both knew that confrontation was inevitable. Ragnos's manifestation had not resolved the succession but complicated it, adding weight to a decision that now felt even more consequential. Within days, the Empire would descend into civil war, and from his tomb, Ragnos's spirit would watch helplessly as everything he built began to crumble. The days following the funeral saw the Sith Empire's careful order disintegrate with shocking speed. Naga Sadow made his move first, a calculated gamble that demonstrated both his cunning and his willingness to embrace risk. The Darrigan siblings remained imprisoned, valuable pieces in the political game unfolding across the Empire. Sadow orchestrated their escape, using loyal operatives to free them from confinement, while carefully ensuring the act appeared to be the work of Kresh's faction. The deception was masterful. False evidence was planted, witnesses were positioned to report seeing Kresh's people near the prison, and whispers were spread through the Sith rumor networks. When Gav and Jory de Regan fled Sith space in their repaired ship, heading back toward the Republic, it appeared that Ludo Kresh had committed treason, releasing dangerous prisoners who could now reveal the Empire's existence and location to potential enemies. Sadow then staged attacks against his own forces, using secret assets to create the appearance of aggression from Kresh's loyalists. Ships were sabotaged, warehouses were destroyed, Sith Lords allied with Sadow were assassinated, always with evidence pointing back to the conservative faction. The Empire convulsed. Those Sith Lords who had remained neutral were forced to choose sides as violence escalated. Old rivalries resurfaced, given new excuse to settle scores. The careful balance Ragnos had maintained through force of personality and overwhelming power vanished with his death, revealing the fault lines that had always existed beneath the surface. Ludo Kresh found himself on the defensive, forced to deny accusations of treason, while simultaneously preparing for inevitable military confrontation. He gathered his forces, calling in loyal Sith Lords and their fleets, assembling an army to defend against Sadow's aggression. His position was politically weaker, despite being morally justified. In Sith culture, appearing weak was often more damaging than being wrong. The first major battle occurred in the Primus Gulud system, a relatively minor holding that became strategically important due to its position between the two factions' strongholds. Sadow's forces arrived first, establishing defensive positions among the system's asteroid fields. Kresh's fleet followed, determined to break through and strike at Sadow's core territories beyond. The battle demonstrated that Sith warfare had evolved considerably during Ragnos's reign. These were not simple ship-to-ship engagements, but coordinated operations involving Force users in key positions. Sith battle meditation coordinated fleet movements with near-telepathic precision. Sith sorcerers aboard capital ships projected illusions that confused enemy sensors and demoralized crews. Boarding parties led by lightsaber-wielding Sith Lords turned enemy vessels into slaughterhouses. Sadow proved the superior fleet commander. His tactical innovations caught Kresh's more traditional forces off guard repeatedly. Ships appeared where sensors said they could not be, thanks to Sith illusions masking their true positions. Coordinated strikes hit weak points in Kresh's formation with devastating precision, and when Kresh's forces attempted to withdraw and regroup, they found their escape routes blocked by forces that seemed to have anticipated their every move. The battle ended in tactical victory for Sadow, but strategic stalemate. Kresh's fleet was damaged but not destroyed. His forces retreated in relatively good order, falling back to fortified positions around the traditional Sith strongholds. Sadow had won ground, but not the decisive victory he needed to claim undisputed leadership. More importantly, the battle had weakened both factions significantly. Ships were destroyed, Sith Lords killed, resources expended. The Empire was bleeding itself in civil war, exactly the scenario Ragnos had hoped to avoid. It was Naga Sadow who recognized the solution first. The Empire needed an external enemy, a threat that would force unity by making internal divisions suicidal, and conveniently such an enemy existed, revealed by the very Republic prisoners whose escape had triggered this crisis. Sadow made his case to the Sith Lords, still willing to listen. The Republic represented everything the Sith should despise. It was weak, divided by democracy and debate rather than unified under strong leadership. It was wealthy but complacent, grown soft during centuries of relative peace. Most importantly, it was ignorant of the Sith's existence, which meant any attack would have the element of complete surprise. A war against the Republic would accomplish multiple objectives. It would unite fractured Sith factions under a common cause. It would eliminate the threat of Republic discovery by conquering them before they could prepare defenses. And perhaps most importantly for Sado personally, it would establish him as the new Dark Lord through military success that even his opponents could not deny. The proposal split the remaining Sith leadership. Some saw brilliance in Sado's vision. Others recognized it as desperate gamble born from political weakness. Kresh violently opposed the plan, arguing that attacking an unknown enemy while the Empire remained divided was suicidal madness. But Sado had momentum now. He began preparing invasion fleets, gathering forces from Sith Lords who supported aggressive expansion. His propaganda portrayed Kresh not as a cautious defender, but as a coward afraid to seize opportunity. In Sith culture, such accusations were difficult to counter without appearing to confirm them. The invasion launched with overwhelming force. Sado's fleets burst into Republic space at multiple points, catching border worlds completely unprepared. The Sith had technological parity with the Republic and vastly superior coordination through Force users. Initial conquests came easily, entire planets falling before they could even send distress signals. Republic citizens who had known only peace for generations suddenly faced an enemy they had not imagined existed. Sith warriors were nightmare figures, wielding weapons and powers that seemed supernatural. Planets burned, populations were enslaved. The galactic community reeled in shock. For a brief period, Sado's gamble appeared to be paying off. The invasion's success drew even some of Krash's supporters to his banner. Victory has a powerful attraction in militaristic cultures. Sado claimed the title of Dark Lord of the Sith, and with Republic worlds falling one after another, fewer Sith Lords felt inclined to dispute it. But the Republic was not as weak as initial victories suggested. Once the shock wore off, once the true nature of the threat became clear, the Republic's vast resources began mobilizing. The Jedi Order, warrior monks who served as the Republic's peacekeepers, took leading roles in the defense, and the Jedi, though fewer in number than the Sith, possessed their own mastery of the Force and centuries of combat experience. The tide began turning. Republic fleets, once scattered and confused, consolidated under competent leadership. Empress Teta, ruler of a powerful Republic sector, emerged as a military leader of exceptional capability. Under her coordination and with Jedi support, Republic forces launched counterattacks that caught overextended Sith fleets by surprise. The Jedi proved particularly effective against Sith forces. Where Sith drew power from aggression and domination, Jedi found strength in defense and discipline. The philosophical differences translated into tactical advantages. Sith attackers found themselves facing opponents who could anticipate and counter their moves, who remained calm under assault, who turned Sith aggression against itself. Sado's greatest weakness was revealed as the war progressed. He was a brilliant tactician, but a mediocre strategist. His invasion plan had focused on initial shock without adequately preparing for sustained conflict. Supply lines stretched too thin. Conquered territories remained unstable, requiring garrison forces that weakened offensive capabilities. And critically, the political unity he had hoped the war would create never fully materialized. Ludo Kresh had not remained passive during the invasion. He consolidated his remaining forces, biding his time, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And as Sado's invasion began faltering, as Republic counterattacks pushed Sith forces back, that moment arrived. Kresh launched his attack not against the Republic, but against Sado himself. His fleet emerged from hyperspace in the Primus Golud system again, catching Sado's forces as they retreated from failed Republic offensives. It was betrayal on a massive scale, Sith turning on Sith at the moment of greatest vulnerability. The battle that followed was catastrophic for both sides. Kryze's forces were fresh and well coordinated. Sado's were exhausted from prolonged combat and demoralized by recent defeats. But Sado still commanded superior numbers and had positioned his fleets well for exactly this kind of attack, having anticipated Kryze's eventual move. The two Sith Lords finally faced each other directly, their flagships meeting in the heart of the battlefield. This should have been the decisive duel, the moment when one vision for the Empire's future triumphed over the other. Instead, it became a funeral for Sith ambitions. Sado, recognizing that he could not defeat both Kresh and the Republic simultaneously, made a choice that would define him historically. He sacrificed the battle to win survival. Using Sith sorcery on a scale rarely attempted, he created illusions that made his forces appear more numerous than they were, buying time for a desperate escape. But the escape required fuel, required distraction on a massive scale. Sadao triggered a chain reaction in Primus Golud's star, causing a supernova that would destroy everything in the system. He gambled that he could escape the blast radius, while Kresh, committed to the attack, could not. The gamble succeeded. Sado's ships fled into hyperspace as the star exploded. Kresh, realizing too late what Sado had done, attempted to follow. His flagship made it to hyperspace, but the radiation from the supernova had damaged its systems. The ship emerged in deep space, crippled and dying. Ludo Kresh died aboard his failing ship, consumed by the same ambition and pride that had driven his opposition to Sado. His forces scattered, leaderless and broken, but Sado's victory was hollow. The Republic's counter-offensive was unstoppable now. They had traced the invasion back to its source. Jedi-led fleets pushed into Sith space, determined to end the threat permanently. World after world fell as the Sith, weakened by civil war and failed invasion, could not mount effective resistance. Naga Sado fled to the remote Yavin system with his most loyal followers, abandoning the Empire to its fate. He would survive there in exile, eventually entering suspended animation, his story becoming legend rather than history. The Great Hyperspace War ended in complete disaster for the Sith. Everything Marka Ragnos had built, the century of peace and prosperity, the carefully maintained empire, all of it crumbled in less than a year after his death. And from his tomb on Korriban, his spirit watched it happen, powerless to intervene, able only to observe as his warnings went unheeded and his legacy turned to ash. The Republic's vengeance was absolute and merciless. Jedi-led fleets poured into Sith space like floodwaters through shattered levees, overwhelming defensive positions that had once seemed impregnable. The Sith Empire, which had endured for thousands of years, which had seemed eternal in its dominion and reach, collapsed with shocking speed. Civil war had bled it dry. The failed invasion had shattered its military strength, and now the Republic brought final judgment. Zeost fell within days. The administrative capital, with its obsidian spires and frozen wastes, had always prioritized governance over defense. When Republic forces arrived in orbit, the remaining Sith defenders mounted fierce but ultimately futile resistance. Jedi Knights led boarding actions against orbital stations, while Republic Marines assaulted the surface installations. The planetary government surrendered after 3 days of brutal urban combat. What followed was systematic dismantlement. The Great Library, that repository of accumulated knowledge spanning millennia, was put to the torch. Holocrons containing the wisdom of ancient Dark Lords were destroyed or seized as dangerous artifacts. Alchemical laboratories were demolished, their experiments terminated, their creations eliminated. The Republic was not interested in preserving or understanding Sith culture. They wanted to erase it from history. Other worlds suffered similar fates. Judos, Relg, Jaguada, all the territories Ragnos had conquered and woven into the imperial fabric. They toppled like dominoes. Some populations welcomed Republic forces as liberators from Sith oppression. Others, species who had prospered under imperial rule or who genuinely revered the Sith as rightful masters, fought with desperate fury and died by the thousands. The Republic showed limited mercy to those who had enabled or benefited from Sith atrocities. Korriban received special attention as the symbolic heart of everything the Sith had been. The sacred homeworld, birthplace of Sith civilization, the planet where Marka Ragnos lay entombed, became the focus of Republic fury. This world, more than any other, represented the source of galactic suffering. Its temples had trained Dark Lords. Its tombs housed the remains of tyrants. Its very soil seemed saturated with malevolent corruption. The Republic wanted not merely to conquer Korriban, but to break it, to ensure it could never again serve as foundation for Shadow's resurgence. The orbital bombardment lasted 5 days without pause. Republic warships encircled the planet in dense formation and unleashed their full arsenal. Turbolaser batteries fired continuously until their cooling systems screamed in protest. Missile strikes rained down in endless cascades. The Valley of the Dark Lords, where countless Sith monarchs lay buried, where Ragnos's crypt stood among dozens of others, received concentrated fire that would have reduced any normal structure to vapor. Explosions walked across the valley floor in rolling waves, casting up massive plumes of red sand mixed with pulverized stone. Tombs that had weathered millennia cracked and collapsed under the assault. Monuments to forgotten Dark Lords were reduced to rubble and scattered fragments. Temple complexes that had housed Sith academies for generations became crater fields. Cities were erased so thoroughly that even their foundations vanished beneath the bombardment. Yet through it all, one structure endured with supernatural resilience. Ragnos's sepulchre absorbed strikes that should have vaporized it. The protections he had woven into its construction during his final years, the wards layered through ancient sorcery and Sith alchemy, they proved stronger than military ordnance. Turbolaser fire left scorch marks, but did not penetrate. Missiles that demolished neighboring structures barely cracked his tomb's outer walls. The concentrated corruption in that place actively resisted destruction, bending reality just enough to preserve what its master had built. From within, his consciousness observed the devastation in something approaching agony. Watching helplessly as everything he had created was systematically erased proved uniquely torturous. The realm he had ruled for a century, the civilization he had elevated to unprecedented heights, it was being wiped from existence. Future generations would know the Sith only as monsters from ancient legends, if they were remembered at all. He had foreseen this possibility during his manifestation at the funeral. His warnings about recklessness and division had been ignored. Kresh and Sado had torn the Empire apart in their struggle for supremacy, weakening it fatally before launching the disastrous Republic invasion. Everything that followed was inevitable consequence of that initial fracture. The bombardment eventually ceased, not because the Republic considered the task complete, but because Korriban had been rendered strategically irrelevant. The planet was a wasteland. Now, its cities obliterated, its population dead or scattered. The temples that had housed Sith knowledge for millennia were collapsed shells. The infrastructure supporting civilization was annihilated beyond recovery. Republic ground forces made brief landings to confirm the devastation and hunt for survivors. Jedi Knights walked through the ruins, their presence in cosmic currents like cold water over burns, soothing yet painful in contrast to the corruption that had once dominated here. They found few living beings. Most Sith who had remained on Korriban during the invasion had perished in the bombardment or fled into the deep desert to die of exposure and thirst. The tombs in the Valley of the Dark Lords received cursory examination, but not systematic destruction. Jedi could sense shadow concentrated in these places like festering wounds in reality, but they also recognized the futility of trying to eliminate every trace. The sepulchres were sealed where possible, marked as forbidden sites, and left to the desert. Over time, sand would bury them, memory would fade, the danger they represented would be forgotten by all but the most dedicated historians. Survivors of the Sith Empire scattered across the galaxy like wind-blown seeds. Some went into deep hiding, abandoning their connection to mystical energies entirely, hoping to escape Republic attention by becoming anonymous citizens on distant worlds. Others fled to the unknown regions, that vast, unexplored territory beyond the galactic rim, seeking refuge in places Republic forces would never find. A dedicated few attempted to preserve Sith knowledge, hiding holocrons and texts in secret caches across multiple worlds, hoping future generations might rediscover the forbidden wisdom. But as unified civilization, as culture and people, the Sith Empire was finished. The governmental structures Ragnos had built were dismantled completely. The bloodlines that had ruled for generations were hunted to extinction or scattered beyond any hope of reunification. The language, the traditions, the entire way of life that had defined the Sith people, it fragmented and dissolved like salt in water. Within a single year, 5,000 years of continuous civilization had been reduced to ruins, refugees, and fading memories. The galaxy moved on with surprising speed. The Republic celebrated victory and turned attention to reconstruction and internal governance. The Jedi Order recorded what they had learned about the Sith in their archives, preserving the knowledge as warning for future generations, while also largely dismissing the threat as historical rather than ongoing concern. Most galactic citizens never learned the full story. They knew there had been a war, that some dangerous cult from beyond known space had attacked and been defeated, but details remained vague. The Sith became footnotes in history texts, cautionary tales about Shadow's dangers, monsters from the past rather than present threats. On Korriban, silence fell like a shroud. Wind continued blowing across red sand, now mixed with the dust of pulverized temples and monuments. Twin suns rose and set on a world devoid of sentient life. In the Valley of the Dark Lords, surviving tombs stood like broken teeth, weathering slowly under Korriban's harsh climate, gradually disappearing beneath accumulating sand drifts. Ragnos's crypt remained the most intact, still sealed, still protected by primordial sorcery, still housing the wraith of its creator. And within that darkness, Marka Ragnos began the longest and strangest phase of his existence, conscious but dormant, aware but inactive, trapped in a form of being that was neither life nor true death. Centuries would pass, then millennia. The galaxy would turn through endless cycles, civilizations rising and falling, heroes and villains playing out their parts. And through it all, the shade of the ancient Dark Lord would remain, waiting in shadows, neither remembered nor forgotten, his story far from its final chapter. 5,000 years is an almost incomprehensible span of time. Entire civilizations rise from primitive beginnings, flourish for centuries, and collapse into ruin within such a time frame. Languages evolve beyond recognition. What seems eternal proves temporary. What appears permanent reveals itself as transient. For Marka Ragnos, those 5,000 years passed in a state difficult to describe. Not sleep, because his consciousness remained aware. Not waking life, because he lacked physical form and direct agency. Something in between, a meditative existence where time flowed strangely. The first centuries were the hardest. His spirit, accustomed to constant activity and engagement, struggled with enforced passivity. He could sense the cosmic currents, could feel the ebb and flow of light and shadow across the galaxy, but he could not directly influence events. His reach extended only to his immediate surroundings, the tomb itself, and perhaps a few hundred meters beyond its walls. Korriban changed slowly around him. The ruins of temples and cities, already heavily damaged by Republic bombardment, continued eroding under wind and time. Sand drifted through broken corridors. Stone facades cracked and fell. Within a few centuries, the proud cities became unrecognizable, reduced to abstract shapes that might have been buildings once or might have been natural formations. The Valley of the Dark Lords weathered more slowly, protected by the lingering malevolent energies concentrated there. But even these monuments showed time's inexorable effects. Tombs that had survived bombardment succumbed to millennia of temperature cycles and sand erosion. Statues lost their features. Inscriptions became illegible. His tomb remained the most intact of all. Where other crypts cracked and collapsed, his endured. Where other wards faded, his persisted. The structure became a time capsule, preserving not just his physical remains, but a snapshot of Sith civilization at its zenith. The galaxy beyond Korriban transformed in ways Ragnos could only partially perceive. The Republic he had briefly warred against continued evolving, expanding into new territories, developing new technologies. The Jedi Order grew and adapted, refining their understanding of cosmic balance, training new generations in the ways of the light. But Shadow was not absent from galactic history during these millennia. Approximately 1,000 years after his death, a fallen Jedi named Freeden Nad discovered Sith teachings and conquered the planet Onderon, establishing a dark side dynasty that would plague the Jedi for generations. Ragnos sensed this disturbance, felt the corruption spreading, but remained trapped and voiceless. 3,000 years after his burial, Exar Kun rose to prominence. The arrogant fallen Jedi discovered ancient holocrons on Yavin 4, learning techniques that transformed him into one of the most dangerous threats the Republic had ever faced. Kun declared himself a Sith Lord and ignited the Great Sith War, gathering fallen Jedi and dark side cultists to his banner. His war devastated Republic worlds and nearly destroyed the Jedi Order before his ultimate defeat and imprisonment on Yavin 4. Ragnos felt Kun's presence blazing across the galaxy, like a dark star. For brief moments, he hoped the ancient traditions might be reborn, that his knowledge might prove relevant again. But Kun's approach was reckless, his understanding incomplete. The war ended in defeat, and Shadow retreated once more. Another millennium passed. Revan and Malak, two Jedi who had fought in the Mandalorian Wars, discovered the ancient Starforge and fell to corruption. They returned with massive fleets, waging civil war against the Republic. They adopted the Sith title, though their understanding of true Sith philosophy was fragmentary at best. Revan eventually returned to the light, while Malak died in the final confrontation aboard the Starforge. Each of these dark practitioners reached towards something they could not fully grasp. They had fragments of knowledge, pieces of the puzzle, but not the complete picture. The true Sith tradition, the civilization Ragnos had embodied, remained lost to history. 1,000 years before the Clone Wars, Darth Bane discovered the ancient ruins on Korriban. Unlike those who came before, Bane truly understood what the old Sith had been. He recognized that the constant infighting and power struggles had always led to destruction. His solution was radical: the rule of two. Only two Sith would exist at any time, a master and an apprentice, working in shadows and patience rather than open conquest. Bane walked through the Valley of the Dark Lords, studying the tombs, learning from the failures of ancient kings. He passed Ragnos's crypt, but did not attempt entry. Perhaps the wards deterred him. Perhaps he sensed that some secrets were better left buried. He took what lessons he needed and departed, establishing a Sith lineage that would endure for a millennium in complete secrecy. Ragnos observed this visitor with interest. Here was someone who had learned from history rather than simply repeating it. Bane's approach was antithetical to everything the old empire had been, yet it proved devastatingly effective. His hidden Sith survived where open empires had failed. The centuries continued rolling past. Around 1,000 years after Bane, his lineage culminated in Darth Sidious, who finally achieved what generations of Sith had dreamed of. He destroyed the Jedi Order, corrupted the Republic into an empire, and ruled the galaxy openly once more. For 2 decades, the Sith controlled civilization as they had not since Ragnos' own era. But that empire, too, fell. Sidious was killed by his apprentice's son, and the Sith lineage ended, or appeared to end. Shadow has a way of persisting even when all its servants are dead. Through all these events, Ragnos remained bound to his tomb, observing galactic history through a narrow lens, aware but unable to act. His consciousness adapted to existence outside time's normal flow. He learned to enter states of deep meditation that could span centuries, his awareness reduced to the barest flicker. Occasionally, dark practitioners sought him out, following ancient star charts and half-remembered rumors. They came to the Valley of the Dark Lords, seeking forbidden knowledge. Most found only ruins and death. A rare few breached his tomb's outer defenses, sensing his presence but lacking the knowledge to truly commune with him. These encounters were brief and usually unsatisfying. The Seekers seemed so small compared to the Sith Lords of his era, their understanding shallow, their ambitions provincial. None were worth the effort of reaching out. Stars wheeled overhead through the centuries. Korriban's twin suns rose and set millions of times. Temperature cycled between scorching days and freezing nights. Dust storms swept across the planet's surface periodically, scouring ruins with abrasive fury. The Valley of the Dark Lords accumulated sand slowly, ancient stones disappearing beneath drifts that grew imperceptibly year by year. Within his crypt, time had no meaning. The shadows were absolute and unchanging. His preserved remains lay untouched in their sarcophagus. His possessions remained where they had been placed 5 millennia earlier. Dust did not accumulate here, decay did not progress. The tomb existed outside normal causality, maintained by ancient sorcery. Ragnos thought often about power and its nature. In life, he had possessed it absolutely, commanded it effortlessly, wielded it to reshape civilization itself. In death, that strength persisted, but transformed. He could still touch the cosmic currents, still channel malevolent energies, but only in limited ways and for brief periods. Strength, he realized, was inseparable from agency. Might meant nothing without the ability to apply it. Knowledge was worthless if it could not be communicated. The silence deepened. Centuries became millennia. Millennia stretched toward eternity. And still, Marka Ragnos endured, neither alive nor dead, neither remembered nor forgotten, waiting in shadows for something he could no longer name. Until, 11 years after the Battle of Yavin, a new seeker arrived. One who would not simply observe and leave, one who would attempt what none before had dared. True resurrection. The galaxy of 11 AB bore little resemblance to the one Marka Ragnos had known. The Republic he had briefly encountered had transformed into the New Republic, rebuilt after the Galactic Empire's fall. The Jedi Order, nearly exterminated during the Imperial era, was being reconstructed under Luke Skywalker's guidance. The political landscape, technology, dominant species and cultures, everything had changed beyond recognition. But some things remained constant. Shadow still called to those seeking dominion. Korriban still held secrets in its tombs, and the name Marka Ragnos, forgotten by most, still resonated with a select few who studied the deepest histories of corruption. Tavion Axmeses was one such individual. She had been a dark Jedi serving under Dessen during his failed campaign against Luke's academy. When Dessen was defeated and killed by Kyle Katarn, Tavion survived but was humiliated, her strength broken, her confidence shattered. Defeat did not teach her humility. It taught her that she needed greater mastery, older knowledge, something that could elevate her beyond the common dark Jedi infesting the galaxy's criminal underworld. She became obsessed with the ancient Sith, believing the pure source of forbidden wisdom had been lost over millennia of conflict, and that rediscovering it would grant her the supremacy she lacked. Her research led through fragmentary records and half-destroyed holocrons, piecing together clues about the original Sith Empire. Most information had been deliberately erased or lost to time, but enough survived to paint a picture of a civilization far more sophisticated in Shadow's arts than anything that had come after. And one name appeared repeatedly in the fragments she uncovered, spoken with reverence that suggested something beyond ordinary historical significance. Marka Ragnos, Dark Lord of the Sith, ruler for a century, a presence that somehow persisted beyond death itself. Tavian became convinced that accessing Ragnos's knowledge, channeling his might, would allow her to accomplish what generations of Dark Jedi had failed to achieve, not just defeating the Jedi, but restoring the Sith to their ancient glory, creating a new imperium with herself as its architect. She traveled to Korriban, which remained largely abandoned, despite occasional visits from Shadow's adherents and treasure hunters. The planet's reputation for danger kept most away. Those who did come seeking forbidden secrets frequently never left, killed by traps, malevolent shades, or other seekers as hostile and desperate as themselves. Tavian was better prepared than most. She had studied what records existed about Korriban's geography and dangers. She brought technological aids compensating for her limited supernatural capabilities, and she possessed genuine passion, hunger for dominion that burned with intensity approaching madness. The Valley of the Dark Lords stretched before her under red skies, ancient crypts half buried in drifted sand. She felt the concentrated malevolence here as palpable presence, thick and oppressive, making breathing difficult. Weaker practitioners would have fled. Tavian pressed forward with obsessive determination. She located Ragnos's sepulchre through combination of research and sensitivity to corrupting energies. His presence called to her, recognizing another seeker, another ambitious soul hoping to claim might beyond natural limits. The tomb's entrance was partially buried but still imposing, flanked by weathered statues depicting Sith warriors in elaborate armor. The outer wards resisted her initial attempts at entry. Primordial sorcery still functioned after 5,000 years, testament to Ragnos's skill and the strength he had invested in these protections. But the wards had weakened over millennia, and Tavian possessed knowledge of shadow techniques, allowing her to gradually unravel the defenses. It took weeks of sustained effort, camping near the crypt, repeatedly assaulting the protections, slowly eroding their strength. Other dark practitioners who stumbled across her attempts either fled or were killed when they tried to interfere. Korriban's isolation meant no one would investigate. No one would stop her. Finally, the wards collapsed. The tomb's entrance yawned open, revealing darkness that seemed deeper than mere absence of light. Tavian entered cautiously, using glow rods to illuminate corridors that had not seen illumination in millennia. The sepulchre was magnificent, even in decay. Sith runes covered the walls, their meaning lost but their potency still faintly resonant. Statues lined the corridors, depictions of ancient lords and warriors whose stone eyes seemed to follow her passage. She navigated traps that had claimed countless intruders, her preparation and caution allowing her to avoid most and survive the rest. In the central chamber, she found her prize. The sarcophagus of Marka Ragnos, sealed with final protections that resisted even her most aggressive shadow assaults, and beside it, placed upon a stone pedestal as if waiting for someone worthy to claim it, the scepter of Ragnos. The weapon was ornate, its head shaped like a stylized Lanvarok, its shaft inscribed with more Sith runes. Tavian could feel might radiating from it, not merely the energy of a well-crafted artifact, but something more. This scepter was connected to Ragnos himself, infused with his essence, a focal point for his lingering consciousness. When she touched it, Ragnos's awareness surged after millennia of near dormancy. For the first time in ages, he had direct contact with a living practitioner, someone whose mind he could potentially influence, whose body he might eventually possess. The connection was intoxicating after so long alone. Tavian felt the presence as well, awareness far older and more formidable than her own, pressing against her mind. She did not resist. She welcomed it, believing this was exactly what she needed. Corrupting influence flowed through the artifact into her, accumulated over thousands of years, and with it came whispers, fragments of knowledge, techniques that Ragnos allowed her to access. She emerged from the tomb transformed, no longer just a failed dark Jedi, but something more. The scepter amplified her abilities dramatically, and through it, she maintained connection with the ancient Sith Lord's wraith. She believed she was using the artifact. Ragnos knew he was using her. Tavian returned to the wider galaxy. With a plan inspired by knowledge, Ragnos fed her through their connection. She would found a cult devoted to resurrecting the ancient Lord, gathering followers who would serve not her, but the legend she promised to restore. The disciples of Ragnos would drain mystical energies from powerful locations across the galaxy, accumulating the massive amounts necessary to truly bring Ragnos back to physical form. The cult grew with surprising speed. There were always Force users seeking purpose and dominion, dark Jedi without direction, fallen students of Luke's academy, mercenaries with sensitivity who had no formal training. Tavian offered them identity and vision, a cause greater than mere personal advancement. They would be part of history, the ones who restored the greatest Sith Lord to life. The disciples began their campaign systematically, targeting planets with strong presence in cosmic currents. On Hoth, they assaulted ruins of Luke's first training facility. On Vajan, they invaded Bast Castle, once home to Darth Vader. On Chandrila, they attempted to drain a nexus point in ancient Jedi ruins. Each location visited resulted in stolen artifacts and drained energies, all channeled into the scepter. The weapon became increasingly potent, glowing with barely contained malevolent force, its wielder gaining abilities that should have been beyond her natural capacity. Kyle Katarn's Jedi detected these attacks and began investigating. Katarn himself had history with Tavian, having defeated her years earlier. He recognized the threat immediately when reports indicated she was leading these assaults. He dispatched his most promising student, Jaden Kor, to investigate and stop whatever plan was unfolding. Jaden was young but talented, having progressed rapidly through training. The investigation took him across the galaxy, following trails of attacked sites, engaging disciples in combat, slowly piecing together the cult's ultimate goal. Each encounter revealed more about the ancient Sith Lord they sought to resurrect, a figure Jaden had never heard of, but who inspired fanatical devotion in his followers. The investigation inevitably led back to where it began, to red sands and primordial tombs of Korriban. The disciples were gathering there in force, preparing for the final ritual that would complete their work. Tavian stood at the center of it all, the artifact blazing with accumulated might, her mind increasingly dominated by the ancient consciousness whispering promises of glory and supremacy. Ragnos, observing through his connection to the weapon, felt something approaching anticipation. 5,000 years of imprisonment were about to end. He would walk the galaxy again, see changes time had wrought, reclaim authority that death had taken from him. All it required was one final infusion of mystical energy, one last sacrifice to bridge the gap between wraith and flesh, and the young Jedi pursuing them would provide exactly that, whether he intended to or not. The stage was set for confrontation that would determine whether the ancient past would remain buried or rise to dominate the present. Korriban welcomed Jaden Kor with the same hostility it had shown every visitor for 5 millennia. The young Jedi's ship descended through atmosphere thick with dust and malevolence, landing near the Valley of the Dark Lords, where disciples of Ragnos had established their ritual site. The dark side presence here was overwhelming, unlike anything Jaden had experienced. It pressed against his consciousness like physical weight, making concentration difficult, turning simple thoughts sluggish and uncertain. The valley stretched before him, ancient tombs rising from red sand like broken teeth. At the center, near the largest and most intact structure, dozens of cult members had gathered. Torches burned despite the daylight, their flames an unnatural crimson that suggested alchemical enhancement rather than natural combustion. Sith runes had been carved into the sand in massive geometric patterns, channels for the dark side energy that would soon be unleashed. Tavian Axmis stood at the pattern's center, the scepter of Ragnos held high above her head. The weapon blazed with power accumulated from a dozen worlds, energy stolen from force nexuses and sacred sites, all compressed into this single artifact. The light it cast was wrong, bending shadows in directions that defied natural law, making the air shimmer with barely contained force. Jaden could feel other Jedi approaching. Reinforcements Kyle Katarn had dispatched once the full scale of the threat became clear. But they would not arrive in time. The ritual was already beginning, words in ancient Sith language that Tavion should not have known rolling from her lips with practiced ease. This was not her knowledge. This was something far older speaking through her. The young Jedi ignited his lightsaber and charged. Disciples of Ragnos moved to intercept dark Jedi and cultists throwing themselves at him with fanatical disregard for their own survival. Jaden cut through them, his training under Kyle Katarn focusing on efficient, decisive combat. These were not skilled opponents, merely obstacles between him and the real threat. His blade moved in precise arcs, deflecting blaster fire, cutting through lightsaber guards, dropping attackers with minimal wasted motion. But there were so many. For every cultist he defeated, two more appeared. They bought time with their bodies, sacrificing themselves to allow Tavion to complete the ritual. Jaden felt the dark side energy building, pressure increasing until his ears popped, reality itself seeming to bend under the strain. Tavion's chanting reached crescendo. The scepter of Ragnos erupted with blinding light, energy pouring from it in waves that knocked nearby cultists off their feet. The tomb behind her cracked open, stone doors that had been sealed for 5,000 years splitting apart as if struck by invisible hammers. And from that darkness, something emerged. Not physical at first, but presence, consciousness so vast and ancient that it made even the concentrated dark side of Korriban seem pale by comparison. This was the weight of 100 years of absolute rule, the accumulated wisdom and power of the greatest Sith Lord of his age, compressed into a single point of awareness. Marka Ragnos, after 5 millennia of imprisonment, was returning. The spirit poured into Tavion, merging with her physical form, her body convulsed, unable to immediately accommodate the influx of foreign consciousness. Her back arched, her mouth opened in a scream that held two voices, her own and something far deeper. The scepter fused to her hand, becoming extension of her flesh, glowing with internal fire. The transformation was grotesque and magnificent. Tavion's features shifted, taking on aspects of Ragnos's ancient physiognomy. Her eyes blazed with crimson light, her skin darkened, developing the pigmentation patterns characteristic of Sith purebloods. Her body grew, muscles expanding, bones lengthening, physical form warping to better accommodate the spirit possessing it. When the transformation completed, what stood before Jaden was neither fully Tavion nor fully Ragnos, but some hybrid of both. The body was hers but moved with confidence and power that had never been hers. The face was hers but wore expressions of contempt and amusement that belonged to someone who had ruled empires. Ragnos looked at his hands, flexed fingers, felt the sensation of physical form after 5,000 years of bodiless existence. The vessel was imperfect, a female human body inadequate for containing his full power, but it would suffice. Through it, he could act. Through it, he could reclaim what death had stolen. He spoke, and his voice carried harmonics that made stones crack and sand ripple. 5,000 years. I have waited 5,000 years for this moment. Jaden steadied himself, adjusting his lightsaber grip. You're not welcome here. This ends now. Ragnos laughed, genuine amusement mixed with contempt. Child, I ruled when your Jedi Order was primitive and weak. I commanded fleets that would dwarf anything your Republic fields, and you believe you can stop me. He moved with speed that should not have been possible, crossing the distance between them in a blur. The scepter of Ragnos swung in an arc that would have decapitated Jaden if the young Jedi had not thrown himself backward, his force-enhanced reflexes barely sufficient to avoid the strike. The battle began in earnest. Ragnos fought with techniques 5,000 years old, styles that predated modern lightsaber forms, movements that drew on Sith traditions lost to time. His attacks combined physical strikes with force powers seamlessly, each sword swing accompanied by telekinetic pushes or dark side lightning. He moved like someone who had spent a century in constant combat, every motion efficient and deadly. Jaden found himself immediately outmatched. His training was excellent. Kyle Katarn had ensured that, but he was facing something beyond mere skill. This was a Dark Lord whose mastery of combat had been refined over 100 years of rule, who had trained generations of Sith warriors, who had personally killed rivals and crushed rebellions. The young Jedi gave ground steadily, his defense barely holding against the relentless assault. Ragnos's attacks came from angles that seemed geometrically impossible, the scepter moving as if it were weightless extension of thought rather than physical object. Twisted energies crackled around each strike, adding concussive force that rattled Jaden's bones, even when his lightsaber successfully parried. "You fight well for one so young," Ragnos observed, his tone almost conversational despite the violence. "Under different circumstances, you might have made an acceptable apprentice, but you are Jedi, and the Jedi must be destroyed." He unleashed Force lightning, not the uncontrolled bursts many dark Jedi managed, but focused, sustained streams of energy that forced Jaden to abandon offense entirely and focus on deflection. The young Jedi's lightsaber became a blur, barely managing to ground the lightning before it could cook him alive. But Tavion's body was straining under Ragnos's power. The vessel had not been properly prepared for full possession, and the sheer magnitude of dark side energy flowing through it was causing physical damage. Blood began seeping from her nose and ears. Her movements, initially fluid and precise, became slightly erratic as the body struggled to maintain integrity. Jaden noticed and adapted his strategy. He could not overpower Ragnos directly, but he could exploit the weakness of the imperfect resurrection. Instead of trying to match strength with strength, he focused on endurance, forcing the ancient Sith Lord to expend energy maintaining the increasingly unstable vessel. The fight expanded across the ritual site, moving between ancient tombs and across sand dunes. Ragnos demonstrated powers Jaden had only read about in historical texts. He manipulated the environment on massive scale, causing stone columns to collapse and sand to erupt in blinding clouds. He created illusions that split his apparent form into multiple images, each one attacking from different angles. He reached into Jaden's mind, attempting to dredge up fears and doubts that would weaken the Jedi's resolve. But Jaden had been trained in mental discipline by one of the best. Kyle Katarn had fought Dark Jedi for decades and knew every trick they employed. The young Jedi maintained his mental shields, pushed through the illusions using force sense rather than physical sight, and continued pressing the attack whenever Ragnos's host body showed signs of strain. The scepter remained the key to Ragnos's power. Through it, he channeled the accumulated force energy from dozens of worlds. Through it, he maintained coherence of his spirit within the physical vessel. And through it, He drew on reserves of strength that allowed him to fight far beyond what Tavion's body should have been capable of. Jaden made a decision that was either brilliant or suicidal. He stopped defending against Ragnos's physical attacks and instead focused entirely on the scepter. His lightsaber moved in tight, controlled strikes, each one aimed not at the body but at the weapon, attempting to damage or destroy the artifact, holding this ancient evil in the physical world. Ragnos recognized the strategy immediately and adjusted his own approach, protecting the scepter even at cost of opening his defense. The two combatants circled each other, the ancient Dark Lord trying to land a killing blow before his vessel failed entirely, the young Jedi trying to destroy the artifact before Ragnos's superior skill overwhelmed him. Tavion's body was failing rapidly now. The skin had taken on a grayish pallor, suggesting tissue death. Her breathing came in ragged gasps. Blood flowed freely from every orifice. The possession was burning through her biological systems like acid through flesh. Ragnos felt it too, the vessel collapsing, his window of physical existence closing. Rage and frustration bubbled up, emotions made more intense by the desperation of facing another 5,000 years of imprisonment. He had been so close to true resurrection, so close to reclaiming power and rebuilding his empire. He unleashed everything remaining in one final assault, abandoning all defense, pouring every bit of accumulated energy into strikes meant to annihilate Jaden completely. The scepter blazed like a star, leaving burning trails in the air, each swing accompanied by detonations of force power that cratered the sand. Jaden met the assault with calm determination, his lightsaber moving in the defensive patterns Kyle Katarn had drilled into him through thousands of hours of training. And in the flurry of attacks, in the chaos of energy and violence, he saw his opening. The scepter, stressed beyond its design limits by the massive forces being channeled through it, developed a crack along its shaft. The flaw was tiny, barely visible, but to Force-enhanced senses it blazed like a beacon. Jaden's lightsaber struck with surgical precision, the blade intersecting with that single point of weakness. The scepter of Ragnos, artifact that had endured 5,000 years, shattered. The release of energy was catastrophic. All the force power stored within erupted outward in a shockwave that flattened everything within 100 meters. Jaden was thrown backward, his body tumbling across sand until striking a tomb wall with bone-breaking force. Nearby cultists were vaporized instantly. Even distant observers felt the wave pass over them like the breath of a dying star. Tavion's body collapsed, the spirit possessing it suddenly lacking an anchor to maintain physical presence. Ragnos felt himself being pulled back, the connection severing, physical sensation fading. He tried to maintain cohesion, to force himself to remain, but the techniques that had worked during his carefully prepared death could not compensate for this violent expulsion. His last sight through physical eyes was the young Jedi struggling to his feet, battered but alive. His last thought before being dragged back to his tomb was a bitter irony. 5,000 years of preparation, of maintaining consciousness through sheer will, of waiting for this opportunity, and it had lasted mere minutes before being snatched away. Tavion died instantly, her body burned out from containing power. It was never meant to hold. The disciples of Ragnos, leaderless and defeated, scattered. Some were captured by Jedi reinforcements that arrived moments after the battle ended. Others fled into Korriban's wilderness, where most would die of exposure or fall victim to the planet's remaining dangers. Jaden Korr stood in the aftermath, barely conscious, his body screaming in protest from a dozen injuries. Around him the sand was fused into glass from the released energy. Smoke rose from burning debris. The silence after so much violence felt almost obscene. He had won, but the victory felt hollow. He could still sense the presence of Marka Ragnos retreating back into the tomb, diminished but not destroyed, defeated but not dead. The ancient Sith Lord would endure, imprisoned once more, waiting for another opportunity that might never come. Kyle Katarn found his student collapsed near the destroyed ritual site, unconscious but alive. Medical droids worked to stabilize his injuries, while other Jedi secured the area and dealt with remaining cultists. As they prepared to leave Korriban, Kyle looked back at the Valley of the Dark Lords, at the tombs standing eternal witness to ancient power and ancient folly. He wondered if they should destroy them all, eliminate every trace of Sith history to prevent future cultists from attempting similar resurrections. But deep down, he knew it would accomplish nothing. The dark side would always attract seekers. Power would always call to the ambitious, and some secrets, no matter how deeply buried, had a way of resurfacing when the galaxy least expected. The ships departed, leaving Korriban to its silence once more. In his tomb, Marka Ragnos settled back into the darkness, his brief taste of physical existence now memory rather than reality. The imprisonment continued, the waiting resumed, and the galaxy moved on, unaware how close it had come to being ruled by a king from 5,000 years in the past. In the shadows of his sepulchre, Marka Ragnos contemplated the nature of defeat. He had tasted it before, though rarely during his physical existence. His duel with Simis had ended in triumph. His century of rule had been unmarred by serious challenge. Even his death had unfolded on his own terms, peaceful and prepared rather than violent and unexpected. But this expulsion back into bodiless imprisonment after experiencing flesh again, this wounded deeper than any blade had in life. For a few precious minutes, he had moved through reality once more, felt physical weight, touched the world with hands rather than mere awareness. Then it had been ripped away by a Jedi, barely beyond apprenticeship. The young one had not won through superior mastery. Jaden Korr had been outmatched in every meaningful way, his skills inferior, his command of mystical energies underdeveloped compared to what Ragnos wielded. But he had won by recognizing the resurrection's fundamental flaw, the imperfect vessel and the artifact sustaining it. Perhaps there was wisdom in that outcome. True deathlessness might be impossible precisely because any method of achieving it would inherently contain vulnerabilities. The consciousness persistence he had accomplished required anchors to physical reality, and those anchors could be disrupted or shattered. Perfect immortality would demand eliminating physical connection entirely, becoming pure awareness merged with cosmic currents, but such beings lost individual identity and dissolved into universal consciousness. He existed in uncomfortable middle ground, neither truly alive nor fully released, trapped in a state that offered endless existence but almost no agency. Yet his awareness persisted. The crypt remained intact. The wards and protections he had woven into its construction 5 millennia ago still functioned with remarkable potency. As long as Korriban existed, as long as corruption concentrated in this forsaken place, his sentience would endure. His legacy, he realized, had taken forms he never anticipated. The realm he built had lasted barely a year past his death, before collapsing into civil war and annihilation. That civilization which had seemed eternal during his reign proved as temporary as morning frost. Everything physical he created, every temple and monument, every law and governmental structure had been swept away by time and violence. But his influence persisted in ways both subtle and profound. The techniques he pioneered became foundational to later practitioners. His innovations in Sith alchemy influenced alchemists for thousands of years. His approach to spirit binding, though imperfect, provided the framework that later Dark Lords would refine. Exar Khan's ability to persist as a shade on Yavin 4 drew partly from principles Ragnos had established. Even Darth Sidious, millennia later, employed essence transfer methods that traced their lineage back to experiments conducted in Ragnos's laboratories. His combat forms, blending traditional Sith blade work with innovative force integration, became templates studied by generations. The way he had structured imperial administration, balancing central authority with regional autonomy, provided models for later Sith governance. His philosophy of merit over bloodline, controversial in his time, eventually became accepted wisdom among dark practitioners. The name itself carried weight across 50 centuries. When Tavian Aximus founded her cult, she chose disciples of Ragnos because that name still resonated with malevolent authority. She was not the first to invoke his memory, nor would she be the last. Across millennia, dark side cults and fallen Jedi, seeking legitimacy, had claimed connection to him, used his name as symbol of ancient supremacy and forbidden knowledge. His tomb became pilgrimage site for seekers of shadow. Even after the Sith Empire's destruction, even after Korriban became forgotten wasteland, those hungry for dominion found their way to the Valley of the Dark Lords. They came seeking artifacts, knowledge, communion with ancient shades. Most died in the attempt. A few succeeded in breaching outer chambers and departed with prizes that would shape galactic history in small ways. The scepter he had carried in life, mundane ceremonial object transformed into conduit for his essence, had proven powerful enough to threaten the new republic. That single artifact, prepared as afterthought during his tomb's construction, nearly succeeded in resurrecting him fully. If Tavian had been stronger, if the vessel had been properly prepared, if circumstances had aligned slightly differently, he might have walked the galaxy again, in truth rather than brief violent manifestation. The galaxy he had known was utterly transformed. The Sith Empire of pure bloods and ancient traditions no longer existed except in historical records. What came after were shadows of shadows, fallen Jedi, adopting the title without understanding its true heritage. They called themselves Sith, wore the name like costume, but they were echoes of something they could barely comprehend. Yet perhaps that was inevitable. Perhaps authentic Sith civilization could only exist in that specific era, under those unique circumstances. The Force itself seemed to prevent any single philosophy from achieving permanent dominance. Light and shadow remained locked in eternal dance, each gaining temporary advantage before balance reasserted itself through catastrophe or revelation. His realm's destruction was part of that balance. The Sith had grown too dominant, too powerful, threatening to tip cosmic scales irrevocably toward corruption. The universal flow responded, creating circumstances that would restore equilibrium. His death's timing, Kresh and Sadow's equal strength, the Darrigan's arrival at that precise moment, none of it might have been coincidence. The Force itself perhaps guided events toward necessary outcomes. Or perhaps that was merely pattern-seeking, finding meaning in chaos, a mind desperate to believe existence followed greater design rather than unfolding through randomness and accident. He thought about supremacy and what it meant. In life, he had possessed it absolutely, commanded fleets and lords with a word, shaped civilization through will alone. That dominion had seemed the ultimate achievement, the pinnacle of what any being could accomplish. But where was that authority now? His fleets were dust. His lords were 50 centuries dead. His civilization had vanished so completely that later generations did not even know it had existed. The monuments he built had crumbled. The imperium he ruled had been erased from living memory. The Jedi Order, which he had viewed with contempt as weak and misguided, had survived for 25,000 years, not through military might, but through philosophy that could be passed across generations. Their influence shaped the galaxy far more profoundly than his century of rule ever had, precisely because they worked with cosmic balance rather than against it. The realization was bitter. His entire existence had been built on assumptions about strength and domination, about power as ultimate virtue. To acknowledge that gentler, more persistent approaches proved more effective across millennia was to question everything he had been. Yet evidence surrounded him. He existed in a galaxy shaped far more by Jedi ideals than by Sith conquest. Even successful later Sith like Darth Bane achieved lasting influence by abandoning the old Empire's approach entirely, working in shadows and patience rather than through open military dominance. The tomb was silent around him, that deep silence unique to places where time moved strangely. Outside on Korriban's surface, wind continued its eternal work, carving sand into new patterns, eroding ancient stones grain by grain. The planet turned on its axis. Twin suns rose and set in their endless rhythm. His physical body, still preserved in the sarcophagus through Sith alchemy, remained unchanged. 5,000 years had not touched it. Another 5,000 likely would not either. The preservation would last until some cataclysm destroyed the crypt entirely, or until the techniques finally failed after unimaginable ages. But he no longer identified with that flesh. It was empty shell, reminder of what he had been rather than what he was. His true existence now was awareness without form, sentience without physical anchor beyond the sepulchre itself. There was strange peace in acceptance. For millennia he had raged against imprisonment, struggled to maintain relevance, plotted ways to return. The brief resurrection had been his greatest effort, final gambit to reclaim physical existence and rebuild something approaching his former glory. Its failure released him from hope. Without possibility of escape, he could stop struggling and simply exist. The desperate urgency that had driven him faded, replaced by something approaching serenity. Not happiness, certainly not contentment, but acceptance of circumstances that could not be changed. The galaxy would continue without him. New conflicts would arise, new practitioners would discover shadow, and believe themselves first to truly understand it. New empires would rise and fall. The eternal dance of light and darkness would continue, each side gaining temporary advantage before cosmic balance reasserted itself. And through it all, in a crypt on a forgotten world, the consciousness of Marka Ragnos would remain, neither dead nor alive, neither remembered nor forgotten, preserved in amber, watching ages pass with detached awareness. His name would surface occasionally, spoken by historians and ambitious cultists seeking connection to primordial might. His techniques would be rediscovered and adapted. His sepulchre would draw seekers for as long as Korriban existed. But the man he had been, the Dark Lord who ruled for a century, that figure was truly gone. What remained was contemplative shade bearing his memories, but no longer sharing his ambitions. On Korriban's surface, another day ended, twin suns set behind ancient tombs, casting long shadows across red sand. Temperature dropped rapidly as it did every night, frost forming on exposed stone. In the Valley of the Dark Lords, nothing moved, nothing lived. Beneath the valley floor, in chambers sealed from time and touch, Marka Ragnos settled deeper into meditation. Memories of his life grew more distant, less sharp, becoming stories about someone else rather than experiences he had lived. Desperation for physical existence faded, rage at circumstances cooled. What remained was simple awareness, observing itself, existence for its own sake, rather than in service of any goal. The darkness deepened. The silence persisted. Stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns. The galaxy turned through its cycles. Civilizations rose and fell like tides. And in the quiet heart of Korriban, beneath sand and stone and shadow, consciousness endured. It was not the immortality he had imagined when beginning these experiments 5,000 years ago. It was not glorious or mighty, or even particularly meaningful, but it was eternal. And in the end, perhaps that was all deathlessness ever could be. The wind whispered across empty valleys. Sand drifted over forgotten ruins. Time flowed like water, wearing away everything except memory. And in that timeless space between life and true death, Marka Ragnos waited, neither hoping nor despairing, simply being, as stars slowly wheeled overhead and the galaxy forgot his name. Until perhaps, in some distant age, another seeker would come, another ambitious soul would stand before his sealed tomb and wonder what secrets lay within. Another voice would call his name into the darkness. And in that moment, he would stir once more, awareness focusing, consciousness rising from meditation's depths, ready to whisper knowledge to those who dared to listen. But for now, there was only silence, only darkness, only the slow, steady rhythm of eternity. And in that eternal quiet, finally, there was peace.